Thanks for downloading the Mukesh interview. My guest today is Dr. Mukesh Kapila, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan from 2003 to 2004. He's well known for being the whistleblower on the United Nations negligence over the genocide in Darfur, the first mass murder of the 21st century. We discuss why some men and women at the top of organizations that were created to do good sometimes choose to look the other way when great wrong is being carried out. We talk about the end of consensus building in terms of human suffering and humanitarian affairs. I ask why we should care about corruption inside a United Nations organization based in Geneva. And in closing, I put the question to Dr. Kapila, does the rapid development in new technological change give cause for optimism in helping indifferent or even frightened men and women find the means and courage to make the right humanitarian decisions and save lives? I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello everyone. Our memories can be very short, especially when it comes to bad, unsettling, or even shameful news. We remember Srebrenica and Rwanda, but many of our younger family members and friends might be hard-pressed to know about the 1950s and 1960s and be unaware of the past large-scale killings in Cambodia, Vietnam, the Rohingya, Myanmar, Indonesia, Latin America, China, the Middle East, and the Near East. Go online and you'll see that the list is almost endless. The beastliness of man towards his fellow man does not distinguish, or at least distinguishes only loosely, between the colour of one's skin, the shape of one's head, the curliness of one's hair, language, or even religious confession. Differences, which can mean life or death to some, can be far more subtle, at least to the uninitiated and unfamiliar. Now today we're going to cast a light on one important and shameful act of genocide. And I'm aware that the word genocide has a particularly legalistic meaning. Mass killings and massacres. And I'm going to do this with the help of a prominent, and as you'll come to understand over the next half an hour, especially courageous man who became a whistleblower on the United Nations over what is widely regarded as the most bloodthirsty and unforgivable mass murder of the early 21st century, namely Darfur. My guest is Dr. Mukesh Kapila, who between 2003-2004 led the UN's largest country mission as resident and humanitarian coordinator for Sudan. Now, there's a lot to talk about, and I do not want to take up valuable time reciting my guest's matchless CV, which you can read on his website, by the way, but you begin to understand the breadth of his experience and the stature of his achievements as our conversation progresses. Welcome to the Mukesh interview, Dr. Kapila. Thanks for making time for me and our listeners, Mukesh, and for inviting us into your home.
Thank you, Michael. I have spent many a happy half hour listening to you and your guests, especially when driving. So thanks for letting me join.
Well, if I could blush, I would. If I could blush, I would. Mukesh, you're originally from India, though for many years you've been a UK citizen, educated from an early age in England, finishing up with degrees in medicine and public health from Oxford and from the London School of Tropical Medicine, respectively. And you are a published author, having written a number of books, including No Stranger to Kindness, and we'll talk about another publication in our conversation. And among the many accolades bestowed on you is the CBE, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for International Service. Mukesh, you work for the British government, the International Federation of the Red Cross, and the United Nations, where, in the case of the latter, you became a public figure over the scandal in Darfur. Please tell me and the listeners about the events that led up to you taking such a drastic and unprecedented step as to become a whistleblower, Mukesh.
Well, the story actually starts in the late 90s when, as a British government official, I was sent to Rwanda. And nothing, not even my worst nightmares, had prepared me for what I saw there. I was in Kigali literally on the day after the liberators had gone in, President Kagame and his troops had gone in, and blood was still running down the walls of the churches, and dogs were eating bodies on the streets, and piles of bodies had meant that the drains were not working. It was just utterly atrocious. And this experience seared me. So 10 years later, I found myself as head of the United Nations in Sudan. And when I witnessed what was going on in Darfur with my own eyes, having heard the world say never again after Rwanda, it was very clear that I had to do something about it. So it's Rwanda that led me to Darfur, and it's really seeing these things with my own eyes that made me want to stand up against the horrors that I witnessed in both places.
And obviously becoming a whistleblower meant a huge decision you had to make. Just give us, I mean, I read your book, and it's obviously a complex story, but give us some indication of the various steps or hurdles, might be a better word, that were thrown up in your way that got to the point where you actually then basically, the straw broke the camel's back and you blew the whistle. Well,
the biggest obstacle was myself. I mean, here I was at a very young age. In fact, at that time, I was the UN's youngest UN coordinator.
How old were you then?
I was in around less than 50.
I see.
You know,
yeah.
And it was the UN's biggest operation in the world. And being a kind of ambitious person, I was imagining a glittering career ahead of me internationally. And then I go and see what's going on in Darfur. And my conscience and I wrestled with each other for about 3 or 4 months. And as I went in and out of Darfur and I witnessed what was going on, what was, I could easily recognize, the first genocide of the 21st century. So it was very, very clear that I would never be able to live with myself and never be able to stare in the mirror again unless I actually do something. So it was my own my own ambition that was the biggest obstacle. But once I'd overcome that, then it was really, the obstacle was my colleagues. It was my bosses at the UN headquarters in New York who told me to shut up and carry on doing my job. It were my colleagues in Khartoum who were extremely abusive. It was a government who threatened me, including threats against my life. And it was those factors, it was the media which pilloried me, and therefore I had to really steel myself.
But this would have been local media that pilloried you.
I talked about local media before I decided in the end
yes, exactly.
that I had a duty to stand up. And the trigger point was when a Darfuri woman came and gave me her personal testimony of what had happened to her, how she had been gang raped in front of her husband and her sons and the whole community. And I really felt that my career, my ambitions, my own family, my own safety was nothing as compared to the horror that was being inflicted on her. And then it was just a moment's flip, and I decided that I had no duty but to speak out.
Well, Mukesh, was it not Plato who said the price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men? I've read your book about Darfur, Against the Tide of Evil, and I should mention to listeners that it's not an easy read, and it's clear to me that there were obviously some good men and women around you in your efforts to get to the truth out to those who had the power to do so. And you mentioned that already, but let me just press you a little bit more. Tell me more about why those efforts failed. Well, how does the bureaucracy work in a situation like that against doing the right thing?
It is a nature of organizations that they are self-preserving. And the UN, which is one of the biggest organizations on the planet, in the public or private sector, is naturally constructed to be self-preserving. Remember that an organization is composed of people, and there are all sorts of people who work in organizations. And those people rely on the organization to give them advantage, and in return, they serve loyally the organization. And particularly when you work for organizations like the United Nations, which are founded on values about doing good, about serving humanity, the organization in the end comes to own you And loyalty to the organization overtakes loyalty to the values that actually drove you to work in these kinds of noble bodies in the first place. And there are plenty of good people in the world, and there are plenty of goodness in the world. But what the world is lacking is courageous people. So as I saw for myself in the UN and other organizations I worked in, it's not that these organizations don't have good, competent, decent people who want to do the right thing. But when it comes to the crunch, they often lack the courage to stand up for themselves. And that's why I had so many obstacles in the UN system.
But let me, as a non-UN person, never had any experience of it, never worked in it, although I've lived in this part of the world, Geneva, for a long time, ask you a rather odd question. What is the United Nations, Mukesh? Throughout your book, you write about the UN as if it was one body, and you're highly critical of some of the upper echelons of leadership, right up to Kofi Annan. But the reason I put this, what may sound like this odd question to you, is that last year I had an illuminating conversation on this very program with a high-level UN Geneva administrator with long experience in New York and Geneva, who explained that more precise language is needed when talking about and criticizing the UN because of its structure. Most of us who observe the UN from afar just see it as one organization. But for the sake of clarity of your former position, please could you explain this structure and how it affected you for good or ill? Because I think the listeners would benefit from understanding.
Well, the United Nations is a massive network of different types of organizations. Some are highly specialized. For example, the World Health Organization we all know about. The International Civil Aviation Organization, so that planes don't crash into each other. Or the International Postal Union. They do all good stuff.
The ITU.
And then there are humanitarian parts of the system, like UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and so on. Then there is a political secretariat of the UN, headquartered in New York, which is where the members of the world get together in the General Assembly and the Security Council and look at world affairs that threaten peace and security. Then there is a development part of the system, the UN Development Programme, the World Bank, which is part of the extended UN family, and such like. So yes, the UN is a very diverse creature. However, I think in one sense the world is right. It is one organization because it is founded on the same values and aspirations. It is the manifestation and expression of a common yearning of humanity, so that when one part of the UN does good or bad, it affects everyone else. So therefore, it's extremely important that we don't fragment the UN system and excuse the misbehavior of parts of it. Because when one person or one organization misbehaves, the whole is tainted.
Well, that's clear, because that's the misunderstanding that I said ordinary people, non-UN people get when they hear the UN, but then people inside the organization say, yes, but that's not quite us. Yeah. Now, something else I wanted to ask you, but on a slightly different tack. In your book, you wrote worryingly that in terms of civilian human suffering and humanitarian affairs, the era of consensus building has passed. What did you mean by that? And does that augur badly for current tragedies in the Ukraine, in Yemen, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, in Somalia? I mean, I've only mentioned a few, but what's your view on that?
Well, unfortunately, what has happened since the end of the Cold War in particular, that the general rules and regulations as well as constraints that affected war and peace have gradually eroded. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, the nature of war has changed. So today, as we see in Ukraine, war is a whole of society effort. Every single dimension and domain is involved, whether it is cyberspace, whether it is air, sea, or land, whether it is in people's homes or in their fields, whether it is in their factories or whether it is with tanks and bombs and bullets. So what that means is that when conflict has become a whole of society affair, and by the way, the same is true in that terrible, atrocious genocide unfolding in Tigray in Ethiopia or elsewhere, as you have mentioned. then the consensus breaks down as to what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. So when you can be a cyber warrior, and when you can also be a warrior in a tank, and when it's very difficult to know who to attack and who not to attack. So in a sense, in today's wars, we are all warriors. And therefore, everyone is game. And therefore, everyone is vulnerable. And therefore, we are moving into an age of unlimited brutality and no restrictions in terms of the horrors we can inflict upon each other. Obviously, it's bad. I'm not saying anything other than to abhor it. But we have to be realistic. And this is not an age for consensus. It's an age for winning or losing.
I see. Well, that's a sobering remark, although it didn't start after the war. I mean, in the way it started before with the Second World War, where the civilian populations were just massacred too, I guess. But my guest today is Dr. Mukesh Kapila, United Nations resident and humanitarian coordinator for the Sudan, 2003 to 2004, and a whistleblower on the UN. Mukesh, returning to the subject of good men and good women, you've recently drawn public attention to corruption inside a UN organization based in Geneva, the Office for Project Services. I think it's called UNOPS. What is that? What has happened? And why should non-UN people, like the listeners to this program, like me, care?
UNOPS, which is the United Nations Office for Project Services, is one of the biggest UN system agencies, turnover of $3-4 billion a year. It's one of the biggest agencies that you have never heard of. But it does quite a lot of the behind-the-scenes work for other UN agencies and also for some governments in basically providing logistical support, infrastructural support, and administrative and human resource services around the world. Works in scores of countries. Now, it's based in Copenhagen, but it has a big office here in Geneva. Unfortunately, a lot of evidence has emerged in the last few months, and this was brought to my attention by friends inside UNOPS, which pointed to a massive fraud and corruption that enveloped the very top of the organization. The executive director of which was forced to resign a few months ago on the back of this. And fundamentally, what they did was that they overcharged their clients. So, for example, if they were asked to build a refugee camp somewhere or to lug relief provisions somewhere, they would charge 3 times the cost of doing it. And those massive profits they put into the bank, which then they use to bankroll highly dubious and corrupt investments through friends of the senior management of the organization.
But that's an old trick, Mukesh. Isn't there an audit department in the United Nations that would uncover that?
You would have thought so, wouldn't you? The problem has been that the audit departments within the UNOPS and the bigger audit department under the UN in New York, they've all been silenced or muzzled because they are occupied by people whose contractual deals mean that they are themselves unable to speak up by their own senior management. So in the end, my feeling is that it is people like the Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, at the moment, but this criticism could be applied previously as well, have actually not shown proper oversight and the governance of these organizations, which include the member states, of which we are all citizens, in showing proper scrutiny of these bodies. And this is a betrayal of the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. And when the most sacred institutions on our planet, that is those of the United Nations system, themselves betray that trust that people have in them, I'm left speechless and incandescent with rage, thinking about the deep betrayal of humanity that they're responsible for.
I can understand that, but is there now a criminal process against culpable people on this, or is it just left that people resign and then they turn the page? What happens?
Well, the previous evidence is that these people quietly retire with their gilt-edged tax-free pensions, and that's the end of the matter. There is a legal process, or should be, but we don't know. This is because of the lack of transparency in the UN Secretariat, which means that even the board of the UNOPS, which is, by the way, meeting as we speak, is not being fully appraised of the legal processes going on. Meanwhile, at least $60 million, perhaps more, has gone astray. This is money given by donors for the benefit of the poorest people on the planet.
Scarcely believable, Mukesh, but let's hope that right prevails on that particular cause. Look, I'd like to finish on two particular aspects of the important issues that you brought to public attention recently. Firstly, one which is particularly close to you. In one of your articles, I read that health should be a bridge for peace. Tell me more about how you think doctors and nurses can deal effectively with men with guns.
Well, let me start first by not being sentimental about the medical profession, which I joined as my first career. We've got to remember that doctors and healers have also committed some of the worst atrocities on the planet. For example, we all know about Dr. Mengele and his Nazi crimes. And there is scarcely a dictator or despot in today's world that don't have their pet doctors to supervise physical and psychological torture that is common all over the world. And you need the doctors to tell you how far to go and when to stop so that they can recover and go back to torturing again. So let me start off by saying that, and I'm outraged that someone in my profession should behave like that. Obviously, it's wrong. Now, I think having said that, what I've seen in my career in countries like Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, and countless other places is that the healing profession can provide a much-needed humanization of the conduct of the war. And what I've learned in, I think, 30 years of dealing with war and peace is that the prospects for peace depend on how the war is fought. The more brutal the war, the more uncompromising the way in which the war is waged, the longer it is, and the lesser the chances of a sustainable finish to the war.
But it begs the question, how? Just tell me what humanization means. Give me an example.
So, for example, what that means is that if, for example, through the work of the medical and other healing professions, and not just doctors, we can, in a sense, even in the middle of the hottest conflicts, show that war has its limits, show that because of mutual self-interest necessarily, it is possible to actually help people who are affected by the war, be they wounded soldiers or others affected indirectly by war. For example, the outbreaks of disease that often follow in conflicts. So I've seen, for example, the Taliban going around with flasks of polio vaccine in their tanks in the past. I have seen in Bosnia, when I was in the heat of the conflict in Sarajevo, the surgeons from both sides collaborating, exchanging patients.
From both sides? From
both sides, from the Bosnian side and the Serbian side, actually exchanging patients because a better surgeon was on one side and the patient needed that surgeon. So you went cross-line to send your patients there and the other way around. So we know that in the middle of all this, and ever since history began, the healing professions have had a sacred place in the way, even in the middle of all these horrors. So my theory is that if we could find an organized way of doing this, then we may not stop wars and the horrors will not stop, but we might be able to provide greater humanity during active war. And by doing that, we might shorten wars and increase the chances of peace subsequently. By the way, this is slightly controversial. It's not necessarily liked by certain organizations because what it does is it also politicizes healthcare and medical care. And clearly, we shouldn't do that because in the end, if we do that, then I think we're going to create more division. So it's a controversial area.
I can imagine. Mukesh, that's my last question. It's the second and last aspect that I wanted to put to you is the role of modern communication, new technology, and what you refer to as borderless humanitarianism. In your 40-year career, you must have seen a lot of technological change. And I read somewhere recently, though they weren't your words, that the UN work culture is fear-based, which pushes the UN away from solving problems. My question is, does the rapid development in new technological change give you cause for optimism in helping indifferent, even frightened men and women find the means and courage to make the right humanitarian decisions and save lives, or is my question just too facile?
No, your question is an excellent one, and the short answer is technology is good. The long answer would be that technology by itself is just a neutral thing, and its tools can be used for good or evil. You only have to look at the railroad, which has been a boon to the world, and yet it's the same railroad that transported the Jews in their millions into the Holocaust camps, right? So the battle we're having now is the eternal battle between good and evil, except today's battle between good and evil is mediated by technology, where the evil people are harnessing technology towards their ends, whether it's a means to make war or whether it is a means to repress people, including human rights abuses and such like. And the good people who are trying to keep one stage ahead, empowering them so that nothing bad happens anywhere in the world without the rest of us knowing about it, even if we are unable to do much about it. So the veil of darkness which has hid evil for so many centuries is no longer possible nowadays. And that can only be a good thing. Now, my own feeling is that in order to harness this technology to give people courage, it requires not just the technical use of the technologies in a clever and innovative way. It requires a form of global solidarity so that people can find courage from each other by sharing their experiences in different parts of the world. I said earlier on, in the analog age, where I had my career, quite a lot of the problems have been that there were many good people, but there were not many courageous people. Well, the problem is still with us today, you see. However, what technology offers us is the ability to grow our courage by sharing our weaknesses across the spectrum, and thereby absorbing the courage of others in a way that we can collectively stand up to evil.
One final question, and I think I know the answer, Mukesh, but I'll ask you anyway. What's your sense of optimism or pessimism? How do you feel about the future?
Oh, I am extremely optimistic. Otherwise, if I was not optimistic, my 40 years of struggle would have been an extreme and utter waste. And that's not the way how I would like to end my life, or indeed this interview.
Mukesh, thanks for answering all my questions with such clarity and such genuineness. I've really appreciated listening to you. My guest today is Dr. Mukesh Kapila, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan, 2003 to 2004. Thanks once more, Mukesh.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for listening. Please share the show with those around you, and if you have any questions or feedback, write to me at contact@mckays.ch. I promise that I will reply to you.